Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be continuing our journey through the Renaissance era of The Walking Dead and delving into the bridge arc that was added for the TV version. As many of you might suspect, it is following this point that the two versions of the story diverge to a yet unseen extent. So as much as I'll try to make sense of the disparities, don't be too surprised if either version is just missing something that was in the other. But without further ado, let us not waste any more time and dive right in. Though before we get into the story, just like with the intro of the series changing, with episode 2, so does the signature
Previously on AMC's The Walking Dead.
As now, for the first time ever, the fourth wall is broken and the narration is delivered by none other than
Previously on The Walking Dead.
In the grand scheme of things, obviously this is a small change that literally means nothing and I just bring it up for the sake of trivia, but I do think that these sorts of fourth wall breaky things are super fun, and with this being Rick, I mean, come on, everybody's happy. Moving into the story, however, episode 2 opens with an immediate departure from the books, as we see that Rick has come to talk to Negan. In the comic, like we covered last time, this was of course Carl going behind Rick's back. Though similar to the book, in the show too, this is posed as a almost regular occurrence of Rick just talking about what's going on with the communities. Obviously, I do think that the Carl-Negan dynamic is sorely missing here, but ignoring that, this is one of those changes that I think works perfectly fine in both versions. With this being Rick, it's just that angle of imprisonment being the absolute worst kind of punishment for someone like Negan, and him effectively shoving Negan's failure into his face with every single story he tells. While with Carl in the books, it was a little more personal and less so about the bigger communities. As for Rick and Negan in the book, these conversations happen a tad later but are effectively the same. Rick brings him food, tells him that they are thriving, and most importantly, asks him whether he has noticed that he swears a lot less nowadays, following up with his own F-boys and insults and effectively just calling him a dog in a cage. So the TLDR here is that the Carl conversations are just truncated, and that is basically it. Also, this marks the second time skip in the TV version, as Rick mentions that it's already been 35 days since the bridge construction began. Again, in the book, there's only ever that one time skip, and everything in the New Beginning arc just keeps on going without any interruptions whatsoever. And also, with the entirety of the bridge arc being 100% TV exclusive, all of the Savior collaborations, conflicts, campouts, etc. are entirely new for the show. The concept of trade routes and maintaining them is a huge deal in the book as well, which we'll get to soon. But it's more so a case of managing patrols and just ensuring safety of these routes instead of full-on constructions as it is with the bridge. Jumping over to the Hilltop, here we see the whole Maggie pseudo-civil war plot continue, with Earl still being imprisoned, and her generally being a lot more apprehensive toward this larger alliance. In the book, at this point in time, there is no conflict whatsoever between Rick and Alexandria and Maggie and the Hilltop. As the communities stand right now, enough time has passed that the immediate problems of all-out war have been mostly settled down. Dwight is leading the Saviors, so he already knows how that works, and the communities as a whole are just flourishing. In the show, on the other hand, with Dwight being pushed on over to Fear, Daryl is sent to take over the Sanctuary, which is something he already doesn't want to do, and then with Maggie still holding that grudge against Negan, things are just a lot more tense across the board. As for Hilltop as a whole, the immediate thing here is the whole imprisonment of Earl, which never happens in the book. Though because he is their blacksmith, a whole bunch of their work has slowed down, and Maggie doesn't want to commit any people to the whole bridge building efforts, which is of course when we see the whole negotiation scenes between her and Michonne. And another thing you'll notice here, especially if you're familiar with the books, is the immediate change in Jesus' role. As of right now, in the comic, Jesus is effectively Rick's right hand when it comes to venturing beyond the safe zones, managing hordes, etc. In the show, on the other hand, because characters like Daryl, Carol, and even Ezekiel to an extent are much more in the forefront, Jesus' role is pretty heavily lessened here, and is remixed to be more so Maggie's advisor and sort of a peacekeeper between Alexandria and the Hilltop. In the comic, this sort of dynamic would also crop up later, but in terms of managing hordes and things like that, he is of course one of our core fighters in the book. And in what is yet another unfortunate case of meta factors influencing the story, this would ultimately be one of the changes that convinced Tom Paine to exit the show, as right from the get-go, he just believed that his role was being seriously snuffed. Almost all of his signature moments from the book, like tossing the grenades back, fighting Negan one-on-one, etc., were never adapted. And unlike the absolute monster of combat he was in the book, the most action he ever saw was that fight with Morgan, someone on his own group. If you remember my highly scientific chart of why I believe the later seasons of the show began falling apart at the seams, I think this is a very, very explicit example of that. It was already here that I think the show just had way too many important characters, and the writers wanted to expand on the stories of what was already expanded, which I think just created this vicious cycle of the story being more and more bloated to the point that even someone like Jesus was pushed to the wayside, simply because we already have enough quote-unquote core fighters. From this point on, we'll be talking about this particular aspect a lot, so when I talk about the comic story and you think a particular character doesn't appear in the show as they do in the book, remember this exquisite flowchart. Anyway, the last thing to mention here is of course the not-so-subtle hints toward Maggie's exit from the show. As she once again references Georgie, yes, she still exists. I don't think I need to expand on that further. With the avalanche of major character exits this season, I don't think it's too surprising that the bridge arc as a whole is quite go and just desperately trying to wrap up at least some character stories. Speaking of the bridge, almost right away we see yet another conflict begin to brew between the Saviors and the joint communities, as Justin, also known as Captain Vane, tries drinking more water than his rations, which then prompts Daryl to give him a solid smack over the face. And while I generally do think that the inclusion of this Remnants of Negan mini-arc was really cool, some lines of dialogue here do seriously make me scratch my head. I'm not sure if this is just a case of me being hyper-focused on the specificities of each time skip, etc, but with a lot of these scenes, I couldn't help just think, my guys, it's been almost 2 years. Why are you talking about this war like it ended last Wednesday? Obviously, such grudges would remain for a long time. And generally, the tenseness between the communities isn't that hard to believe either. I mean, it's human nature after all. But especially when Rick talks about how it'll be hard for a while, it really seems like we're still dealing with just the immediate fallout of the war instead of the true new beginning. In the book, I always read the time skip as being there to effectively show us Rick's vision and how his leadership brought them here. While there were still plenty of issues on the horizon, they were mostly above these petty arguments and stood as a united front. The show, on the other hand, prolonged the already severely prolonged all-out war, and I think seriously dampened the breath of fresh air that Season 9 could have been right from the get-go. I think for more casual viewers, if they heard through word of mouth that the show would have a big creative shakeup, and that there'd be this huge time skip of almost 2 years during which everything changes, it may be enough to recapture some of that lost interest. But I think when they tune in and see that even now the Saviors are just a constant thorn in their side, perhaps they just once again tuned out with the assumption that it's these growing pains that the season will focus on. And so, they might have dropped off even before seeing the next big bad, which would exactly require the communities to be united. This is of course purely my own speculation, and viewer figures from this point on become super unreliable due to the ever-increasing popularity of streaming services, but I imagine this is a relatively likely scenario. And then from my behind-the-scenes point of view, the positive sentiment around the latter half of Season 9 obviously has a substantial lag to it. So when the production team is already working on Season 10, but still seeing that interest is declining in the series, I would not at all be surprised if, even despite the positive sentiment, budgets just kept on being slashed. I've said this before, and I'll say it many times, the worst villain in The Walking Dead is AMC after all. Anyway, that's enough meta talk, but do hold this thought for a minute. In story, the other big thing here is the clash between Rick and Daryl, which to me is probably the absolute best part of the early season. Especially lines like,
"Are we though? We on the same side, Rick?" "Well, you tell me."
Really screamed that this is a far cry from their brotherly bond we had seen thus far. At this point, Daryl and Rick's relationship seemed to be back to Season 1 and 2 days, so who knows what might happen here, right? Though we'd of course soon find out that it was merely setting up an absolutely heartbreaking juxtaposition. Though yeah, the only problem I'd raise here is that clearly this entire conflict and pseudo-civil war was rushed and never really fully explored. So instead of being a full storyline, it was effectively just a plot device for Rick's and Maggie's exit. Whether that's a good thing, well, I guess it's hard to say. I do think that the whole savior thing was already way too old, but at the same time, I do think it is very rushed and much of it is just like, yeah, trust me. But whatever the case, soon thereafter we cut on over to the lumber crew, and there too things soon take a turn. Similar to the comic, the group is kiting a Horde to ensure their safety while the whole construction is going on. But it's not long until we see that one of the relays is messed up, and the Horde then heads right for the lumberyard. And while I do very much like myself some Rick going ham with the hatchet, something that was of course a huge staple in the early parts of the comic, here too I think there is a much bigger meta conversation to be had around what this Horde represents. As I've mentioned throughout the retrospective, this sort of Horde kiting is nowhere near as prevalent in the comics as it is in the show. So in the TV version, I feel like some of that novelty has also just simply worn off. Though what I think is even more important is the actual outcome of this horror ordeal. In the book, we open a new beginning with the group kiting what is the largest Horde they have ever managed without anyone ever being in danger. A clear masterclass in planning and skill that immediately tells us that during the past 2 years, they have learned an absolute ton. There is undeniable change. Contrast that to the TV version. Way back in Season 4, the group was already doing some light management of walkers so that they don't pile up on certain parts of the fences. In Season 5, Rambo Carroll single-handedly walker bombed Terminus. Season 6 begins with an insane walker kiting mission on a mass scale. Season 8, again, starts with another walker bomb on the Sanctuary. And now we arrive at Season 9, supposedly a whole 19 months after the latest walker mission. And still, the whole thing just descends into an all-out battle, which once again begs the question of, why does it feel like so little has changed across those nearly 2 years? It's only after the massive time jump post Rick's departure that it feels like the show moved closer to the comic version. And to me, that is a part of Season 9 and the multiple time jumps here that just seems odd. Anyway, another fun sequence here is of course Rick shooting the rope on the stacked up logs, which sends them rolling down the hill and plowing down the walkers in what has to be the most video game thing I've ever seen. But don't forget that there also exists a universe where those logs just annihilate the rest of the people fighting lower down the hill. It's also here where Aaron's arm is crushed, upon seeing which, Enid calls him out for doing it on purpose because he just wanted to be like his hero, Rick Grimes from the award-winning graphic novel The Walking Dead. Jokes aside, they cut off his arm to stop the bleeding, and for many comic readers, at this point, it very much seemed like he's being set up as the Rick step-in for everything to follow, particularly when it comes to Alexandria-related events, as Denai Guerrera would too be leaving the show. To some extent, those theories did turn out to be right, with him being an important figure in everything surrounding the community, but ultimately, it just turned out to be a really cool look for him, and I don't think it was deliberately trying to replicate Rick or anything. But yes, it looks absolutely awesome. In story though, after seeing this, Daryl jumps right to blaming Justin as his radio apparently wasn't charged and beats him up yet again, driving an even bigger wedge between him and Rick. Though one thing that I absolutely loved that is still going on in the background of all of this is that what we're watching is still that same retelling of Rex. And so, once we return to the prison cell, we get the absolute perfection of a line that is,
"That's a real pretty picture you paint there, Rick. When it finally goes to you, make sure you come back and you tell me all about that day too."
And with this line, I think the stark difference the adaptation has taken should be very clear. In the comic, Rick's vision brought them to the greatest point they have ever been. While in the show, Negan is straight up right. It's almost posed as Rick being naive. Sure, he ends up saving everyone involved by blowing up the bridge, but in this particular instance, Negan's got him figured out to a T. I mean, if you boil this entire thing down, Rick's wishful thinking ended up with him nearly blowing himself up and being saved by the almighty plot helicopter. So, yeah, Negan did sorta kinda predict literally everything that would happen. But all the meta implications aside, this is one of my absolute favorite Negan-Rick interactions. First of all, the fact that Rick is painted as two-faced, with one side of his face being shrouded in darkness, is just straight up excellent, clearly implying that underneath this newfound peacefulness still lies that same Rick of...
Shut up.
And then when Carl is mentioned, you can feel that rage boiling inside of him. And as I've mentioned a number of times already, these mentions of people who have died always seemed oddly scarce in the series, so I just appreciate it on that basis alone. And like I mentioned before, similar scenes happen in the book, it's just the way that they're framed that's a bit different. And yeah, like, in the book, Negan is not right. Rick is 100% right. He established this entire network of communities, like, literally from nothing, whereas the show sort of changed that, and Rick almost got himself killed, and he's sort of naive, and Negan is 100% right, which does seem sort of odd, but whatever. In the midst of all this, Jadis's, or Anne's, but I'll keep calling her Jadis for simplicity's sake, story is also going on. All of this happens over the course of a few episodes, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just cover the entire thing at once. And before we do, absolutely nothing even remotely close to any of this happens in the book. Jadis doesn't exist, there is nothing like the CRM or any helicopter for that matter. At this point in time, Gabriel never leaves Alexandria and is in no way a fighter. He doesn't have any romantic relationships or anything like that, and for all intents and purposes, he is 100% a background character. But back to Jadis, she sort of starts getting together with Gabriel, but then she sees the CRM helicopter again, and so her intentions of dating Gabe are gone in a jiffy. With the benefit of hindsight, we of course now know a lot more about the CRM and her intentions of trading people, the whole A-B classification, etc, etc. For those of you who didn't bother sitting through the slow drudge that is World Beyond, the current understanding is that A's are test subjects for Project V, while B are some sort of workers/inmates/something like that, which is now further corroborated by the series finale when Rick has escaped, clearly showing that B's are not tested on or disposed of. But anyway, point is that upon seeing the helicopter, she once again gets in touch with the CRM and effectively just wants to order a Uber out of here. As to why Gabriel never mentioned the helicopter to literally anyone ever again? Well, because he thought he'd be in the secret helicopter club with Negan, who also saw it and literally never mentioned a single word about it again, because plot, am I right? Also at the same time, we still have the whole Oceanside savior hatred going on. Like I've mentioned a number of times already, the Oceanside in the books is effectively just there for the sake of world building and nothing more. So this entire thing is 100% added for the show. Generally, I think it was a pretty interesting little subplot, which I only now realized also pretty heavily mirrors the final season, with both Maggie and Daryl going a little season 5 Rick. Though yeah, not much to add here, it ultimately doesn't do much for the story and is essentially just tying up the loose ends with Simon. Of course, there is another debate to be had here around how, yet again, the time skip thus far seems almost redundant, considering the same exact plot could have taken place literally 2 days after the war was done. But I digress. On Rick's side, we see a similar scene from the book, where Rick and Eugene just talk about the whole planning side of this whole ordeal, and Rick just mentions that Eugene is one of the most important parts of everything they're doing. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but I think the way they handled Eugene's character in the show is easily some of the best stuff they've ever done in the show. So I think with scenes like these, we're just pulling him out of that awkward, weird Negan-Eugene phase. Again, we'll have plenty of time to talk about him in the future, so that's where I'll leave it for now. Back at Alexandria, the Negan drama simply does not end, as we now see Michonne go to speak with him. Negan is doing a hunger strike of sorts, and so Michonne goes to smack some sense into him. Nothing like this really happens in the comic, and while there is a scene with Andrea going to see him, it's not really under the same circumstances or anything. Similar to the book though, Negan is absolutely miserable and just begs Michonne to talk to him, just like he does with Carl. But perhaps more importantly, they also have a much more open conversation where Michonne goes as far as to bring up Andre and how she still sees him everywhere. Something I am pretty sure we hadn't addressed since all the way back in season 3. On top of that, Negan begins talking about Lucille, whose story we'd of course get to see relatively soon in Here's Negan. So in terms of these character-centric added scenes, I do think this was a nice touch. Leaving Negan and Michonne for a bit, we return to Rick and Daryl, where Daryl tricks Rick into taking his motorcycle back to Alexandria to basically stall him and allow Maggie to go after Negan. Again, none of these little Civil War shenanigans happen in the book, and while Maggie clearly still hates Negan, there is never anything close to a plan hit on him, let alone deliberately trying to take Rick out of the way, etc, etc. As for the duo, they end up falling in a pit where absolutely all hell breaks loose and the emotion bombs just keep on coming. Daryl explicitly calls out Rick for this whole Negan saving charade and tells him that without Glenn, he would have never survived. He would have never found his family. For the millionth time, any explicit mention of a dead character by name is always a win in my book, and with this absolutely bringing us full circle in just a second, it is a very, very bittersweet reminder of everyone's favorite pizza delivery boy. And as if that wasn't enough, Daryl then comes clean about how they allowed Oceanside to get revenge on the remainder of the Saviors. And that moment of Rick just breaking and saying,
He becomes a martyr. The war was for nothing. Carl died for nothing.
oh man, this is literally peak Daryl and Rick interactions. Like, please, come on, why did Rick have to leave the show? Though, soon thereafter, walkers begin swarming, and so getting out of the hole quickly becomes a matter of survival. First off, I think Rick giving him his hand is a pretty clear callback to Chupacabra, where Merle appeared to Daryl in a vision instead, aka another brother who tried pulling him up. Though as they get out of the hole, Rick tells Daryl to just go and that he will kite the Horde away and that they just can't destroy the bridge. And don't get me wrong, the whole pale horse symbolism here is as transparent as it could ever be, but where did this boy come from? I am all for dramatic scenes, but you can't just set up this twist as Daryl deliberately takes Rick away from the campsite to stall him, and then just magically make a horse appear that 1. Magically avoided all the walkers, and 2. Is patiently just waiting for Rick to now get on. Like I said, it's cool, but it makes no sense. Okay, my angry, that makes no sense brain aside, obviously I loved every single thing that happens here. And that shot of us just panning out as the walkers begin to swarm Rick is brilliant. And following this point, I could gush about just every small little thing here because I'll be honest with you, I think this dream sequence is easily some of the best stuff The Walking Dead has ever put out. But not to spend another hour here, I'll just go through some of my own personal highlights. First off, the music here is just straight up a Dark Souls boss and it is excellent. Those overbearing, almost painfully loud booms are just so good. And here, Rick riding the pale horse, almost trying to outrun death itself, is of course crystal clear. And man, us going full circle and seeing that shot of Rick riding into Atlanta again, I will never forget watching this episode for the first time and just being covered in goosebumps. The sheer dread, sadness, nostalgia, and about 30 other emotions mixed in there was just something else entirely. It's one of those things that I think many series nowadays will have a very hard time replicating. Because for all of its faults, The Walking Dead has went on for literally over a decade. The emotional investment that amount of time brings shouldn't be understated. The fact of the matter is, most series never make it past the first season, let alone, again, a literal decade. And oh boy, then John Bernthal returning as Shane is just perfect. If you've seen The Sopranos, this whole ripping through memories, visions, and dreams really reminded me of that certain part of the story. Obviously, no spoilers, but if you've seen it, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. And the conversation between Rick and Shane is both the most meme-worthy and the most epic thing at the same time. Like for real, Shane here is like straight up 90% of the Walking Dead fanbase.
The church with the red machete, that is what I'm talking about. That's that I need from.
And that sharp transition of Shane yelling, "Wake up," as we snap back to reality and Rick is just being swarmed. Perfection. And because this episode was just dead set on playing with our emotions, we then cut away from Rick to see Maggie going after Negan. In terms of comic parallels, like I've already mentioned, no one is going after Negan, so there is no scene of someone protecting him or keeping keys or anything like that. The Maggie Negan introduction, on the other hand, is a solid example of just how ridiculously the season plays out in terms of the comic story, because much of this is taken from issue 174, an issue that literally came out a handful of months before season 9 started filming, and almost 50 issues ahead of where we are right now. Though yeah, the whole Negan begging for a death scene is both very faithful in terms of what happens, but also quite a bit different in the wider circumstances, as again, it just happens so far into the future. Returning to Rick though, the next dream sequence might just be the most painful one as it takes us back to Hershel's farm. Sadly, Scott Wilson passed away shortly after filming this, so clearly it now also carries a lot of very real emotional baggage. But man, is it just a beautiful sequence. The peaceful, almost picturesque sunsets, the music now being this slow and somber piano.
It's beautiful.
Everything here is just heart-wrenching. And as much as I love Shane and his dynamic with Rick, I will always take just this small moment of peace over all of that. Though before Rick can accept his death, saying that he might finally be with his family, Hershel then tells him to wake up yet again. Which then leads us to what is visually my favorite sequence in this one. We see Rick back at the hospital where it all began. But the signature "Don't Open Dead Inside" door, more commonly referred to as the "Don't Dead Open Inside," has now changed to "Open Dead Outside." And as Rick stumbles outside, we just see this endless sea of bodies in this grey mist. I know I've said this a million times throughout this retrospective, but this is easily one of my favorite shots in the entire franchise. For those of you who don't follow the comic and the alternate covers, this is a direct replica of the issue 100 alternate artwork depicting this exact scenario. Rick just standing amidst the bodies of those we've lost. And also from a detail point of view, you can pick out a whole bunch of characters here. And of course, also Greg Nicotero, who just had to slip himself in there. Though aside from the visual spectacle, Sasha is the third person to appear to him, which I know originally caused a lot of confusion as to why it would be her of all people. I'm not trying to dunk on Sasha, I think that much is clear, but Lori, Carl, and even Glenn would be your obvious picks for this final visitor, right? From a technical perspective, I haven't found any concrete information, but from what I'm able to gather, this was actually supposed to be Glenn originally, but just couldn't appear because of scheduling. As to why it is Sasha though, I honestly think Andrew's own interpretation was really cool. He explained that the hallucinations of Shane, Hershel, Sasha, and ultimately Michonne at the very end is a reference to the Wizard of Oz. Shane gives him courage, Hershel gives him heart, Sasha gives him wisdom, and Michonne is home. Personally, I really like that way of looking at it, and story-wise, I think it actually fits really well. But after all of that, we of course get the double whammy, as Rick thinks he has found them. But no. Whoever decided to do this is just straight up cruel, but man is the sequence excellent. The ridiculous contrast of emotion that is set up here as Rick finally mumbles,
I found him.
That tragic reality of all of Rick's dreams just washing away, with the music abruptly cutting to complete silence. And then those strings coming in as, just like with Merle, we linger on Daryl, who has just lost another brother and is just standing there in sheer and cold sorrow. That is then juxtaposed by Michonne, who is just screaming at the top of her lungs, but we don't hear any of it. It is just deafening silence as those slow strings and piano play. And finally, we see Daryl just stumble back into the forest. Rick is the one that brought him into civilization again, and now he is gone. And to some extent, his grudge against the Saviors is what caused it. So now, he just goes to where he thinks he belongs. Alone and just somewhere in the wild. Meanwhile, Michonne, who literally just talked about losing Andre and don't forget is pregnant at this point, just screams in complete agony. And with that, we simply fade to black. That is, until we hear radio chatter and Jadis watching the smoke. Though as the helicopter hovers overhead, Jadis notices Rick washed up on the coast. At which point she calls to the chopper saying she never had an A and that Rick is actually a B, just simply begging for rescue. And as they do, we go absolutely full circle as Space Junk begins to play, just like all those years back with Rick being stuck in the tank and Glenn calling him on the walkie-talkie. Now, don't get me wrong, I already think this is a perfect send-off. Okay, maybe except for the magic horse. And I do think that Space Junk here fits in perfectly. But like I've been saying throughout the retrospective, and just like Andrew Lincoln himself wanted, Johnny Cash's Hurt should have been playing here, and I will fight anyone who claims otherwise. Okay, who am I kidding? I'm not going to fight anyone, but I am still right. As for what Rick's exit means in the bigger story, well, even now, I hold a very mixed opinion on him just being magically airlifted out, because clearly, it is a huge cop-out with the hope that Andrew would like to return to the series. So on one hand, I almost wish he was just killed off and we'd be done with it. And in the same vein, clearly the entirety of the bridge arc is effectively manufactured to be Andrew's exit. So if he were to just be killed off, maybe we could have done that with the Whisperers. But on the other hand, I became the Leo pointing meme when he appeared in the series finale. And as I think every Walking Dead Turbo nerd, I am eating up every bit of behind-the-scenes information I can from the Rick spin-off. So on that front, I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether this miraculous survival, plus the endless questions of why he never searched for his family, etc., was ultimately worth it. So TLDR, the jury's still out for me. Though with Rikidu being airlifted out, we get what is the biggest brain timeskip transition that the series has done. Because as the helicopter flies off, we stay on this house, until it suddenly just fades into ruin, clearly implying that a very, very long time has passed. And similar to the book, we see Magna's group fighting off a whole bunch of walkers. Only, instead of Jesus riding up with horses and the Horde being an actual mega wave of nearly infinite walkers, they hear gunshots and a voice from the woods, upon reaching which, they meet none other than Lil ass kicker Judith Grimes. And with that, this is where we'll pick up next time. There is a long debate to be had around Judith's new role and everything surrounding that, which I just don't want to jam in here at the very end. So the only thing I'll say here is that as much as I think the bridge arc is the flimsiest part of Season 9, mostly because of external factors, Rick's exit was handled, if not perfectly, then as close as you can get. All that being said, here I would honestly love to hear your takes on Rick's exit. Are you still holding off judgment until we see his story wrapped up? Do you think keeping him alive was just another cheap ploy by AMC? Is it a mix of both? Do let me know, I am genuinely curious. Though next time we'll be delving into what are now two massively different timelines which differ by literally 7 years, and how they approach the build up to the Whisperers. So I hope to see you back then. And that's the video. Well, the Rick saga is over, and now we enter the absolute final stretch of The Walking Dead. From here on out, these comparisons will get dicier and dicier by the minute, so for those of you only familiar with one version of the story, I hope you're looking forward to that. Though with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.